Our next speaker in the Evolutionary Origins of Speech Acts conference here at the University of Bucharest is Professor Ladislav Koreň. It's a pleasure to meet him, and I'm delighted to look forward to his talk. And his talk today is titled A Pragmatic Genealogy of Asserting. Thanks so much for being here with us, and please take it away.
Thank you, Andrei, for introducing me. And thank you for having me and for having invited me, you and Mitch. It's a great occasion. So my talk is entitled Pragmatic Genealogy of Asserting. So I would like to start with some historical background of this stuff. So it's stuff that I already published in two books. One is my monograph, Practices of Reason. It's the chapter 1 of that book, but it was also a version of that was also published in a collective volume called Social Institution of Discursive Norm. And this paper or this stuff is an output of a project, research project in grant called Inferentialism, Naturalized Norms, Meanings and Reasons in the Natural World, which is supported by the Czech Science Foundation. The last output of this project is due to the principal investigator of the project. I advertise it here. It's called Normative Speeches. It would be relevant to this conference also, so I recommend it. And now, what is the topic of the paper? So my point of departure in this paper is some kind of intuitions of mine or assumption of mine. I mostly do not argue for that. I assume it for the sake of argument, is that assertions are speech acts that seem to be intimately related to social practices of giving and asking for reasons. So that means that there are communicative acts of stating claims about what is the case, such that one commits oneself to it being the case and undertakes a responsibility for it being the case what one claims. Importantly, this responsibility or commitment involves that assertions are treated as inappropriate if they are not defensible vis-a-vis queries or disagreements or challenges. And this defensibility includes paradigmatically something like publicly making other related claims which are supposed to provide some supporting reasons for those original commitments. So assertion typically serves also as potential justifiers of other claims or proposals or doings. And the intuition behind this paper is that a speech act or a precursor of the speech act which lacks these features is unlike our at least full-blown assertional practice. That's my starting point. And as I say in those papers, I'm not arguing really for that point. I'm assuming it's kind of intuition behind the paper, which seems to me plausible. So I call this a dual role of assertion as potential justified because their credentials can potentially become an issue in case of disagreements or challenges. And also the second role is justifiers because there are moves which provide reasons for or against other such moves. So it's the dual role of assertions as justifieds and justifiers. And I submit that whatever else assertion may also be, there are public performances playing this crucial dual role in human discursive activities. So it follows, according to this picture, that a good account of assertion should do justice to this dual role of assertion, to this, that is, to their role in a reasoned discourse or in a practices of giving and asking for reasons. So, and to put my cards on the table, myself, I find promising so-called normative accounts of assertoric practice or speech acts, according to which speech acts are, in general, social language games of sorts which are governed by rules or norms of their own. These norms or rules sort of determined how commitments or entitlements of both producers and consumers are instituted or affected in the way of performing a speech act of that kind. Different speech acts or practices are governed by different sorts of norms of this sort. So of the norms, this sort of determined commitments and entitlements on the part of both producers and consumers. An account of assertion and its relation to games of giving, asking, and reason in this general normative style looks promising, at least to me, and as far as I know, to many people, although there are, of course, opponents of this approach. But specifically, I favor, because there are many normative accounts, many types of normative accounts, specifically, I tend to favor so-called dialectical accounts of assertions, which directly account for the dual role of assertion in terms of their distinctive normative profile and practices of giving and asking for reasons. So probably the most famous author, although there are historical anticipation of that, probably the best developed or most famous account along these lines is Brandon's account, fully developed in his book, Making It Explicit, but there are also other versions of the accounts, some of them including McFarlane's account, Rescorla accounts, Shepard. There are subtle differences between them, but the core idea, if I can state it like this, subtleties aside, is this one. Incurring a distinctive commitment by way of asserting a sentence P belongs to a social normative practice in which the asserter is being treated as licensing or entitling audience to reassert the sentence or to draw various inferences from the sentence, including practical inferences, based on asserter's original authority, as it were. But also this authority or license is supposed to be baked up by a commitment or responsibility to vindicate to interlocutors, actual or potential ones, what asserter claims if a challenge arises. A challenge can be a question, although Brandon has a different view of that, but more generally, a challenge can be considered like there is a disagreement, somebody disagrees, has a different commitment or makes a different claim which is incompatible with the original one, or simply questions the original claim. And this defense or vindication of the original commitment can be done via deference to the original source of the assertion, or via elimination of the objections or challenges, or via direct provision of reasons supporting the assertion. So that's the big picture, or the idea which seems to be shared by most dialectical accounts, although there are subtle differences between them. I won't go into these details of the differences, but now you may, and I hope so, or the paper is so structured that it seems that many people would at least agree that full-blown assertion is related to practices of giving and asking for reasons along the lines described by dialectical accounts, including this dual role of assertion as justifieds and justificators. You may not agree, though, that dialecticism is the most promising approach to assertion taught current, like in all respects. For instance, you might be attracted to various hybrid accounts which also incorporate dialectical responsibility to defend assertional commitments, but they incorporate it along other characteristic features, including, for instance, liability to censure and so on. As I read Mitch Green's papers, some of them, they go in this direction. Neri Marsili, recent forthcoming paper, also argues in this style. So I wouldn't insist that for the purposes of my paper, it's not important that you would agree that dialectical approaches are the most promising approaches, but it seems to me what's promising on them is that they capture this important dialectical role, dual role of assertion. And that's enough for my paper, or maybe enough for these presentations. Even so, it seems to me, if you agree with the first point, my main objective in this paper may speak to you. And the objective is to, which is relevant to this conference, is to reconstruct, broadly speaking, something like the evolutionary rationale and development of such a practice, so related or so embedded in the practices of giving and asking for reasons. That's my main objective. I don't think that I give super convincing arguments to favor dialecticism across the board, but I think that I have something to say about how such a practice could have been developed. So, my strategy in outline combines so-called pragmatic genealogy. There is a good book, a recent book on that by Quellos, like general book about the approach, about the philosophical approach called pragmatic genealogy, but also evolutionary theorizing. So I freely combine what I know about evolutionary theory, including cultural evolution or coevolution, with philosophical genre, which is called pragmatic genealogy. Pragmatic genealogy has a main question, it seems to me. The question is, what function or value could a recognizable human practice, a kind of important one, such as assertion, or its protoforms have had for our ancestors with certain plausible human needs and capacities that could plausibly explain its progressive elaboration from these protoforms into its current form, something like that. My approach is inspired by a famous pragmatic genealogy by Edward Craig, but his genealogy concerns the elaboration from a state of nature of our epistemic practices involving the concept of knowledge. But my aim or objective is to reconstruct it in a similar spirit and probably in a way which is more informed by evolutionary theorizing, the discursive practice of assertion with its characteristically dialectical or dual role or its embedment in the games of giving and asking for reason. Therefore, I define the initial state, a state of nature, which I call a discursive state of nature, a bit differently, although I'm inspired by Craig. So it differs my description of the initial state, I call discursive state of nature, in different terms, in several aspects. But most importantly, for my current proposals is that talk, or something like claim-making practice, is not presupposed at the beginning, but it's supposed to be something to be reconstructed. Whereas as I read Craig, he already somehow presupposed something like claim-making practice, something like testimony, and then then his genealogy proceeds from that point that given that we have something like testimony, we need to identify reliable testimonials and so on and so on. I do not presuppose that. I think that we have to reconstruct that point and to move from that point farther towards the reconstruction of assertion. So to what I can just sketch, outline what I say in the paper. So how I describe or characterize this initial starting point, this discursive state of nature. So I suppose, or I imagine that this initial state, the starting point, is inhabited by ancestral human beings who are already depicted or characterized as socially living or interdependent beings that stand to benefit from coordination, cooperation, and communication, or basically some form of signaling. So as I depict them, these are the kind of beings that need, gather, and process valuable information in order to navigate their biosocial habitat. And they have so-called onboard perceptual, cognitive, and inferential skills to this purpose. We can also assume, or I assume in this portrayal of the discursive state of nature, that they have elements, some basic elements of both social and normative cognition, which would be important for me because I would assume that they are capable of assuming something like normative attitudes. But short of any demanding mind reading and mental meta-representative skills, I will say something about that shortly. They are capable of producing simple signals or utterances which reliably correlate and therefore are indicative of features of their habitat, which might be useful. So at first it might be non-intentional or non-voluntary and not specifically addressed. Eventually it becomes more voluntarily controlled and so on. But importantly, this kind of simple utterances they are disposed to emit might be informative for consumers, typically for conspecifics, if they are indicative of something useful for them. So something useful in terms of their fitness, basically, and at this stage. In that case, those beings or creatures, as I call them, can extract valuable information from each other's utterances, supposing that those utterances are such that they reliably correlate with useful features of the environment. The others, like conspecifics or audience, can extract valuable information from this. So this kind of creatures reliably emitting this kind of utterances serve as sort of each other cognitive proxies, or may serve as each other cognitive proxies. So even if I do not have this kind of information directly, I can eventually gather it from others' responses who have it directly, for instance, on the assumption that there is this reliable correlation of those signals with useful features of the environment. So if so, these creatures also stand to benefit from coordination of such responses should they deviate from the beneficial regularity. So this regularity might be beneficial given that it is a regularity. But if creatures start to deviate from this regularity, they might not be so beneficial. But given that they benefit from this kind of signal, it's also in their interest to start to coordinate, including like in the cases of deviation from the regularity. So as I elaborate on this point, there is a rationale for some kind of first order shaping of dispositions towards this mutually beneficial regularity. And this shaping or first order shaping is done by so-called normative attitudes. But normative attitudes might be just some kind of negative attitudes, might be affective attitudes, might be some kind of proto-censorious attitudes and so on. So something like normalizing or maintaining the beneficial regularity by adopting some kind of normative shaping attitudes. But there is also, I don't have the time to go into details. I also assume that there would be space and rationale for some kind of higher order shaping of dispositions to adapt such normative attitudes so that they shape the first order regularity. The idea is that at some point, it's not enough just to adapt normative attitudes to first order responses like utterances, but also you have to coordinate those normative attitudes in order to get this benefit at the first order, roughly speaking. So, so in this way, when I'm skipping a lot of probably important details, but in this way, if we suppose that we have a state of nature inhabited by creatures with such dispositions, including dispositions to adapt normative attitudes and to coordinate normative attitudes, in this way, eventually, it seems, we can imagine that such creatures may develop so as they would be able to distinguish and normatively treat certain types of utterances, very simple types, as fit for, even called for in certain types of situations. So we will have something which Mitch calls probably some kind of calls or something. I call it explicitly calls, and I'm also inspired by something like calling practices in primates and so on. So for instance, we can imagine that our creatures would distinguish and normatively treat certain types of utterances as fitting and being called for in certain type of situation, for instance, situation featuring tigers and not in other situations. So, and they may similarly process and respond to a host of other utterances, possibly including and differentiating between more generic signals, for instance, generic signal for some kind of predators, or predators in more generally, and more specific signals for more specific predators, for instance. But we can imagine that it's not beyond, it seems that some kind of precursor of such practices, signaling practices, we can identify in other species. So it seems to me, that's why I raised the question in the Q&As following Mitch presentation. It seems to me that this presumably also requires that originally probably push-me-pull-you signals or calls become treated at some point as more specialized or emancipated such that they would have something like, clearly something like word-to-word direction of fit. It seems to me plausible to presuppose that at some point there would be no such a distinction, but eventually something like that distinction is called for, at least if we really want to identify a stage at which something like reports or claims emerge in this picture. But I have nothing really illuminating to say about that. I would like to, but not today, probably. So, and just to have a kind of perhaps a quotation, which is probably better than mine, and it's from the book of my colleague and the principal investigator of grant. Is the picture is something like this, oversimplified, of course. Once there is a tendency to associate a sound with a situation, and this association serves some useful purpose, and of course crying danger in dangerous situation is useful, the association may come to be taken by members of the community in question as proper. That's kind of important because it suggests some kind of normativity or proto-normativity, as something that ought to be, which might be perhaps a bit strong, but it's so good. This is to say that the members may start trying to avert one another from emitting the sound in inappropriate situations, and at least in some cases from not emitting it in appropriate ones. Thereby, the link ceases to be a matter of a mere association of tendencies or dispositions and start to be that of a propriety. It acquires a normative character. So I have in mind something like this picture. And I have two comments at this juncture. On my picture, which of course is not an uncontroversial picture, so that's why I'm emphasizing this. I see it as an advantage of this picture. Maybe somebody would see it as a drawback. But on this picture, creatures with such dispositions serve as each other cognitive proxies. That means, in my picture, it is in their mutual interest to shape their verbal dispositions, including via these normative attitudes, so as to be able to continue to reliably extract valuable information from them. In that case, it seems to me, we needn't assume any strong and possibly implausible forms of altruism in sharing information, which might be evolutionary problematic, although some people insist on that. It seems that no such a motivation, no strong altruism in sharing information is required to explain coordination and cooperation in communication and information transfer of this sort, because I assume that it's simply in the mutual interest of all the creatures to continue this practice of serving as a cognitive proxies of each other. Also, social and normative cognition of sorts, basic one, is required, but I assume that no robust mind reading, certainly not no reflective intentions, communicative intentions is required to oil such kind of practices. So I do not deny that those beings are intentional beings, cognitive beings capable of processing information. I do not deny that they are sensitive in some ways to affective and other states of other beings, but I do not need to presuppose, and I take it to be an advantage of this picture, any higher mind reading capacities, for instance, or meta-representational capacities. They might evolve, but only later, perhaps hand in hand with more elaborate linguistic practices, which are only to come in this picture. So also, it seems to me that initially such responses may be more or less spontaneous, maybe some would even say reflex-like. That means that they require, at least initially, a little intentional or voluntary control, but then they may become normatively mind-shaped via these normative attitudes, so as to become increasingly intentionally controlled or under voluntary control. It seems to me that voluntary control might have something interesting to do with normativity, including being specifically addressed and adjust to other audiences. So I can imagine that some calls are not specifically addressed to anybody in particular, but I can also imagine that this face-to-face interaction, which was emphasized by Bart-Gertz. It's kind of important. But it seems to me that this might be this way or another way, but at least this is the picture, that such niceties and subtleties, complexities are supposed to come only later in the picture. And the second comment, from a comparative perspective, and there are, of course, better experts on that, but from my reading, at least, of the relevant literature, there are both commonalities as well as differences. So the commonalities, it seems to me that there are analogs or precursors of such signaling practices in other species. For instance, the already mentioned monkey calls or chimp's food calls, but also relevant probably are gesturing practices, or maybe some combination thereof. I'm open on that. And I see some pressure from Bart-Gertz's picture that we should take more seriously this chimp-like communication face-to-face. I do not have quite clear idea which way I would go, but it seems to me that kind of hybrid or combination is possible. I have some reason for that, because it seems to me that it's not very clear how to get from face-to-face interaction something like displaced reference, whereas I can see how displayed reference might be developed out of these calls or something like that. But I'm open on that. There are reasons for some combination probably. Anyway, private practices also seem to exhibit a more or less elaborate, call it proto-normative infrastructure, including analogs of normative attitudes. There is some encouraging, there is some censoring in primates and something like that. It seems to be that it's, at least you may call it proto-normative practices. Somebody would call it them directly normative practices, sort of normative attitudes. So these are commonalities, but there are also differences, or as I see it, apparently it seems in different primate species, normative attitudes have not been applied specifically to communicative signals. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that from all the examples which we discussed, it was not so clear that there is this kind of fruitful combination. It seems to be important in human communication, this combination of normative attitudes and signaling. It's a shaping of signaling, basically by normative. Or if there is such combination, anyway, it's not that robust or systematic as it's in our species. That seems to me probably some of the maybe.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you do know that for those of us online, we're still on slide 12.
Sorry, because I'm working with two.
Thank you.
Presentation on two computers. So that's the slide on the commonalities and differences. So the differences, as I see them, is that normative attitudes, although they seem to be present in our species, are not systematically or robustly applied specifically to signaling practices in those species, whereas in our species, that seems to be the case, and that seems to be important. So now stage 2. So from this kind of signals or calls or whatever they are, to something closer to talk. And so, of course, to human language. It seems to me that this is not yet anything like claim-making practice worth the name, still less an assertional practice with a dual role. That should be, seems to me clear. Maybe we can talk about proto-reports of sorts, but it doesn't seem to me that we can talk, it's justified to talk about claim-making practice of an assertional type. To get closer to a claim-making practice with a dual role, I submit we need a more holistic structure of interrelated utterances with finer normative inferential structure. Maybe something like this, again, take this with reservation, just maybe example, maybe there might be better examples. For instance, the larger structure with a finer normative inferential structure would be like this. For instance, an utterance such as "low tiger over there" would be treated as appropriate in situation featuring a tiger. Another utterance that's an animal or that's stripped, that eats meat, that attacks or something like that would be treated as implied by the utterance that's the tiger. So it would be treated appropriate whenever the utterance "that's tiger" is appropriate, or something like that. It would be some kind of proto-inference. Or another utterance type "that's a deer" would be treated as appropriate in different situations featuring deers, not tigers or other things or animals. And the utterance, yet another utterance type "that's an animal," or "that doesn't eat meat," or "that doesn't attack" would be treated as implied by that utterance type "that's a deer." And "that's a tiger" and "that's a deer," this kind of two different utterance type would be treated as sort of excluding each other whenever applied in the same situation to the same thing. So in a sense, they can't both be appropriated. They can't both be appropriately applied in the same situation to the same object. Or something like this. What I mean is that we need something like a system of utterances which are in what is called inferential relations, including incompatibility relation. Why am I emphasizing that? Well, it might be emphasized purely for the semantic reason, because there are theories that semantic propositional content needs such kind of structure. This is controversial, of course, but I do not need to make this controversial commitments, although I am kind of sympathetic to this inferentialist approach to semantics. But it seems to me that we need this kind of structure if we want to get something like assertions with a dual role. Because the dual role involves that something serves as a premise and something serves as a potential conclusion. And something serves as a kind of challenge or opposite or contradiction to the original claim or something like that. So in order to have the dual role, we need to have an inferential structure. Maybe we do not need to have an inferential structure to get the propositional content, but we certainly, it seems to me, need to have such a structure in order to get something like assertions or speech echoes assertion. That's my point. So at the next stage, the stage 3, I emphasize that we are still not yet done. If we wish, even if we have the structure, sorry. Maybe, okay. So even if we have the structure, inferential structure, we still do not have something I would like to call assertion. It's just the prerequisite. It's a previous step. So if we want to get assertion into the picture, we need to have one more step or two more steps or something like that. But we already have building blocks for that step, because we now have utterance types such that they seem to have a word-to-word direction of fit. There are something like reports, so basic protoclaims. Other utterances of the same time are treated as inferable from them, and other utterances of the same time are treated as incompatible with them. And this creates, it seems to me, something important. This creates a space for disagreements and counter moves. So also the space for something like reason giving or justification. So once we have the stage 2, once we have a richer inferential structure of utterances which may serve as premises, conclusion, or as incompatibles, there is already a space opens up for disagreements, for counter moves, objections, challenges, and so on, and hence for something like reason giving. And that seems important because we want to account for assertion as the speech acts with this dual role of justifiers and justifieds. So to hash this out, at this point, we have a situation which creates a space for socially unstable situation of disagreements or conflicts or discoordination of commitments. At this stage, such situation would likely to arise. For instance, again, to oversimplify, and I'm inspired here by Hugh Price's account of disagreement and reasoned discourse and assertion as embedded in that. For instance, we can imagine that one critic says something signifying something like lion is over there. From his perspective, it might look, as a lion, not as a tiger. But another critter might say, no, deer is over there, because from his perspective, it might look rather as a deer. So what to A might look as a lion might look like a deer to B, but we have an incompatible commitments which can be directly expressed as such because they have already utterance types which provides the space for such oppositions. Or another possibility is that one of them might simply deviate from a pattern of use shaped by normative attitudes. Anyway, there's some kind of discoordination of commitment. So this seems such kind of disagreement situations seems to involve incompatible or anyway not coordinated commitments or commitments not shared in common ground. And so this would create all sorts of problems for beneficial cognitive and behavioral coordination, not just for cognitive coordination, but just also for the coordination in action. So continuation of this is that insofar as such situations are socially unstable, as I presuppose that they are socially unstable because they sort of complicate coordination in cognition and coordination in action, cooperation, they call for a solution. So this is a trouble at this stage, this kind of disagreement or lack of agreement, not coordinated commitments. So it calls for a kind of solutions. It seems to me, assume plausibly that parties to such disagreements won't easily give up their different commitments. For instance, by placing greater trust into interlocutors than they would into themselves. It doesn't seem to me plausible to presuppose that such kind of disagreements would be generally solved that one party just places the trust into the other party as the right one. At least this wouldn't be general case. We can imagine that, I don't know, children do so with respect to authorities, but not general. That would be not the case in general. But they also, it seems to me, cannot, at least not in general, agree to disagree. A coordination seems to be needed. In most cases, it's not an option to agree to disagree. Anyway, it's a kind of more complicated process, but they need it. They need to coordinate. So a peaceful, that's the idea, which is not probably a novel one. I do not think so, but it's involved, for instance, in Hugh Price and in other authors. It seems like at this point, something like a peaceful, if argumentative, communicative strategy of resolving such conflicts and establishing coordination of commitments would seem to be desirable for those kind of creatures. Especially if we assume that this kind of disagreements are between creatures who are socially independent, interdependent agents of roughly equal standing and capacities, which, for instance, might be plausible because we know that for the most time they were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, and they are famous for having, at least mobile hunter-gatherers, for having something like egalitarian structure and so on. So it seems to be the idea of peaceful resolving of such conflicts via communication. Seems to be that we wouldn't resolve by physical power, but by the power of reasons or something like that. So at last, something resembling an assertion may enter the scene at this juncture, which I assume. So our ancestors at this juncture start to provide, expect, and ask for reasons and provide them in the form of further sayings of the same kind in situation involving discoordinated commitments. And they would link this kind of claiming practice to something like authority, credibility, and justificatory responsibility with a view to possible counter-moves, disagreements, or challenges. And in this way, we get into the picture eventually. I am simplifying and skipping over the details, something like duality, because we would have, already we can imagine these creatures to have elaborated because they face this kind of need to resolve disagreements via coordination, via something like reason giving. We would have sayings of the proto-claiming type, which would become treated as requiring support or justification. and also other sayings of the same time, which would become treated as called for to provide such support. So eventually the idea is that we would get eventually something which is very close to assertion, maybe without some niceties and subtleties, but which would already somehow have this kind of dual role of justifieds and justifiers. And so if I still have 5 or 2 minutes, 2 minutes, perfect. I have 2 slides. So at the end of the presentation, I have some comparison with Mitch pictures, because it seems to me to be congenial in some respects. Both strategies congenial, I would say. So I do not probably need to recapitulate the core of Mitch's approach, but what I find congenial is that signaling practices of sorts come first. And they are designed for information transfer or transmission, as Mitch made clear. Verbiage calls, probably maybe something else, maybe some combination, become elaborated into basic claim-making practice. Something which Mitch suppose already possesses something like propositional content and truth conditions. I'm not sure about that. I don't think it's that important at this point, but that's the idea. What's important for me is that there is this gradual elaboration of this verbiage calls into something like non-government claim-making practices or speech acts of assertion with some asterisks or something not really full-blown, but already via these 3 stages, assertions which are supposed to be subject to liability norm, semi-assertion, ditto plus subject to sincerity norm, and eventually this assertion, which is ditto plus dialectical norm. So Mitch obviously has a kind of account, evolutionary account, which tries to account for this dual role of assertions in an interesting way. And I have I reserved my comments and questions, probably more questions for this presentation, because its paper are basically on the same topic. So differences, possible differences, maybe there are not differences at all. So I think that setting aside the vexed issues of what determines propositional contents, whether some inferences or something else, assertion with a dual role would seem to require a structure of inferentially related utterances, as I tried to make clear at one slide, some kind of incompatibles and premises conclusions. It's not that clear to me, at least from this paper presentation, what correspond to that in Mitch frameworks and account, but I think it can surely be incorporated. Maybe Mitch would answer that. So I didn't see in the paper or the presentation a state which involves this kind of incompatibilities or inferential relations. That's one suggestion or comment. Another one, Mitch also suggests in the paper, not in today's presentation, suggests that the practice governed by liability and sincerity norms, just by these 2, is the semi-assertion, is like, that's kind of objection, that's kind of comment for insiders, is like merely opinionated assertional practice described by Hugh Price. Such a practice, according to Price, wouldn't yet allow for interpersonal, specifically interpersonal social engagement and negotiation of beliefs and commitments. They would be like, people wouldn't be interested in such kind of speech acts because they would be basically subjective or something like that. So there would be no pooling of knowledge. There would be no reason for reason and argument, and so no motivation. I'm not sure if this is the case, because once we have liability in force, which is supposed to be enforced already in the first stage of assertion, it seems to me that there is already a friction. So because why would I censor another's utterances at this stage if I didn't see them, perceive them as incorrect? So whereas in the Price picture, this practice of more assertions is supposed to be like, no need to engage with one another, given how it's described. It seems to me that, as Mitch describes his first 2 stages, there's already a need to engage with one another, so not necessarily a need to argue, which may come only at the last stage. So that would be just my contribution to the debate. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. And would you like to field your own questions or should I?
So,
Would you like to field your own questions or should I? What would you-
no, you can.
Okay, great. Any questions from the room?
But we should also see who's online.
Sure.
You can tell.
Let's just see here if there happen to be questions. Great. So if there are any questions online, please don't hesitate to use the raise virtual hand button. All right. Great. Thanks. Mitch, please go ahead. All right, thanks very much, Ladislav. Just responding to the 2 points that you made at the end about comparison of our two approaches. The first one was about essentially to what extent am I incorporating or can I incorporate an inferentialist approach into the, as it were, the story of the establishment of semanticity. And for my purposes, I just wanted to be neutral on that question. And so I think it's compatible with what I say, that one gives an inferentialist approach to how semantics gets off the ground, but I wasn't trying to commit myself to it. I was trying to be neutral. So that's, I think, the answer to the first. And the second was, I wasn't sure that if all you have on board is a liability norm, liability to be right or wrong, you have enough to count as what Price would call friction. Because I understood his notion of friction as being something more like this, that we're in a position to substantively disagree with one another. And that strikes me as something more likely to come about only if you have the desire, the expectation that if I say something, you could challenge me with a, how do you know that to be so? Or how is that the case, or something of the sort. So my thought, just this is probably a point about the interpretation of what Price is doing in his paper, but I was thinking that friction is only going to be possible in his sense if you've got a sort of giving and asking for reasons sort of structure, and therefore more verbal complexity than you'd have. For example, in my case of verbiage, for instance, you'd have to have, why do you think that? What are your reasons? Give me some support. What about this potential challenge? That sort of stuff. That seems like where friction has its home in Price's thinking. Now, I'm not sure that's the only place you could give some notion of something like friction, but that's what I thought he was focusing on. So that was my reason for putting it the way that it did, but I don't think it's a big subject of dispute. And I think, you know, there's friction-like things happening in different areas of this sort of discourse that I think we should be open to. So I think that's all I just want to make one further comment, which is that I wasn't sure if you're committing yourself to it, but something I'd want to just clarify is that sometimes an answer to a how do you know challenge or some other kind of challenge to my assertion or something like an assertion is not giving reasons in a verbal form, but just to point at the thing that I'm talking about. Show you take you over there and have you look at it more closely so you can see what I take myself to see. That is to say, sometimes the answer to a question is just, let's go look, right? And so I think that, you know, some of the inferentialist or other types of, in some ways, Branham-inspired ways of thinking about speech acts suggest that the way to respond to a question is with an answer in the form of a verbalized answer that is an assertion or something like it, which I would say sometimes the answer to a question is, it's right over there, let's look, right? It's something that doesn't even have to be verbalized, it should just be a gesture. So that's just a clarification. I'm not sure it's a direct disagreement with what you said.
I myself would consider that kind of response to be kind of reason-giving response.
Okay, good enough for me. Yeah, okay. What about the friction?
I think that as you describe the practices at these two stages, already at the first stage, it involves what Price would like to call a science, because it seems to involve something like a notion of truth or correctness. And he says that in order to have disagreements and to solve them via reason and argument, we need to have enforced something like norm of truth.
Right.
It seems to be close to your norm of liability.
Right, but that's a necessary condition.
That's a necessary.
But I don't think that's a sufficient condition for friction as Price mentioned. I'm not sure.
It
That's the way.
seems to me that it is. He argues that there is no reason to engage in reasoned argument if you already don't have on board something like sensitivity to truth, if
Right.
only implicit.
Right, but again, that still seems like a necessary condition.
He
I'm not sure
doesn't
it's
say
sufficient. but
Yeah.
you know, we can just say price is wrong. I'm not sure there's so much to say about that. I understood the notion of friction as having its own in giving reasons in support of what I said. Those which reasons can be challenged by the provider. That's what I took friction.
We can talk about it later. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much to both. We have a new question from Lonnie. Lonnie, please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Super interesting. I just was wondering on this point about there being no kind of need for altruism or strong altruism in sharing information. I'm not, as I'm understanding it, the idea is that it's just mutually beneficial to develop these information sharing abilities. Is there any point in your picture where that kind of altruism does emerge, or is it always a matter of it's useful for coordination, even at the point of like giving and asking for reasons?
Well, that was, thank you. That was a kind of minor point, because I do not deny that there is some kind of altruistic sharing of information. Tomasovo et al. Argue that they have some evidence that, especially already in human infants, there is an altruistic pointing and so on. But it seems to me that at this stage, which we want to account for something like evolution of basic human signaling or basic signaling practices, my idea was kind of inspired by Ruth Millikan, that if we imagine that other conspecifics are already naturally disposed or designed to emit some kind of responses in some kind of situations, we can use them, not intentionally or consciously, as sources of valuable information. So in this sense, we can serve each other as a cognitive proxies. And given that it's useful for all of us, it can be explained as kind of mutualism, which is weaker than any altruistic sharing of information. It seems to me a good feature of that, although I do not deny that at some point we probably would also have to account for something like stronger sharing of information or something like that. That was just the point, that if you think about this functions as each other cognitive proxies in this kind of sharing of information via signaling, we needn't presuppose any strong altruism in sharing information. So that was the point.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Just part of the reason I'm asking is going back to this point about where questions and asking comes into it. If they come into it early, then this is the puzzle I have in my head. It's like why we develop that practice of asking early, and even in that early sort of discursive state of nature potentially that you're describing accurately, I think, whether there has to be some kind of altruism in that picture, or whether it can just be purely about, or where that might emerge if there does. But anyway, that was just the context of trying to think about that side of the practice.
Thank you.
And just as a brief follow-up to what Lonnie was saying, maybe there's something more to consider there sort of metaethically. So if you think of Rayleigh's notion of altruism as enlightened ethos, right? This idea that perhaps there's some prudential basis in the long run for being altruistic in the here and now, something of the sort. So maybe there's some kind of application of that idea to information technology. In a surgeon that's applies specifically to small groups.
Maybe, but I have no view about that yet, so you can discuss it later. Thank you.
Great, awesome. Other thoughts, comments from the room?
Maybe try one more. I'll just say it loudly.
Okay, good. Shout.
I'll shout. Does the role of sincerity play during work in your reconstruction, or do you want to leave that on its side?
I would like to leave it or postpone it as to the later stages, because it seems to me that it presupposes something like mind reading. Or you also made this point that in order to honor some kind of sincerity norm you have to represent beliefs of other signals, and it seems to me that it's kind of complex feature, even if you take like analogy, which is problematic with ontogeny. So let's dispute when children start to represent false beliefs, but they already seem to be capable of some kind of talk, making, understanding a lot about the assertional practice. My view is that basically our kind of human representation of beliefs is sort of co-evolves, co-develops with our assertional claim-making practices. That's why I do not want to have beliefs before, or at least representations of beliefs before this kind of claim-making practices.
But do you want to say that, I guess my question, would you agree that one, maybe you can call it constitutive one of assertion is sincerity, or would you want to neutralize?
Yeah, I understand the question. I have something to say about that in the final section of the paper, in which I try to say that this kind of dialectical approach can account for other distinctive features of assertion, which are usually emphasized, such as sincerity, liability, especially, but liability seems to be built in Brandon's first conditions already. Some kind of expectations in the assertions should be knowledgeable or should be warranted or something like that. I don't know if these are all constitutive or something like norms of assertion, but I think that dialectical approaches a la McFarlane or Shapiro can account for them. Sometimes they say that sincerity norm may not be specific to assertion, maybe just some kind of moral consideration which applies more generally, or something like that. Or sometimes they account for sincerity like indirectly, that if you want to present yourself as committed to defend your claim, why should you say something which you don't believe? But this is not really to say that it's I'm not sure about that. So
can I just point out that you might want to say, I'm tempted to say 3-year-olds might just perform assertions and not be fully inside the practice.
That's plausible. It sounds plausible.
Thank you.
Great, thanks both. If there's some other comments online, or perhaps some more thoughts that were stirred in the room. And if not, please join me in thanking Dr. Koreň.